Everybody in America who was interested in investigations in law or wanting to be where it was happening seemed to want to be on the Watergate committee. There were certainly 100 for every slot. And we were in an era where the Library of Congress had the only computer that was on Capitol Hill. There were none in the United States Capitol building. In fact, let me go back because I think I skipped a slide. I would like to go back. Yes. I didn't skip the slide, but I forgot to point out, the green arrow is the Senate side, where I ended up working. The blue arrow is the House side. They're at least a quarter of a mile apart in the same building, and they're different universes. But none of them had a computer. The only computer was in the basement of the Library of Congress. It was an IBM 360. Which filled an entire room, and in those days computers had to be chilled. It had to be 60 degrees, absolutely frigidly cold in a computer room because they generated so much heat, they took up the whole room. Like half of this room would be one computer. And what the committee most needed was people who had some law background, but more importantly knew something about computers, because they had made a decision to use computers to computerize the evidence. First time it had ever been done. Now, it also helped if you were from North Carolina, and it really helped if you knew Rufus Edmiston, if you want to be working on the Watergate Committee, because he, as you can see, had Sam Ervin's ear, and he hired all the staff. Well, I had met Rufus Edmiston through singing. That's Edmiston sitting over on the left. Now, this picture was taken 5 years after we were together on the Watergate Committee. But one night, I was entertaining some law students, or at least they seemed entertained, by my guitar playing and singing, and Rufus Edmiston happened to walk by. And he was pretty famous already by then, and he wanted to sing with us. So he sang with us for a couple of hours that night, and so I met Rufus Edmiston casually before I turned around and applied for the job. I got the job. I got on the Watergate Committee staff. Over on the right-hand side it says Pres Camp Act. That's the Presidential Campaign Activities Investigation. It was not called officially the Watergate Committee, but that's my Senate ID from the 93rd Congress that got me into the building each day. And this picture, which was only taken about 5 years ago, but the building behind me has not changed in appearance at all in the 40 ensuing years. That's where the Committee to Re-elect President Nixon had its offices. They had that building. And it was known even to its friends by the acronym CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. So everybody referred to it as CREEP. And the first day I was on the Watergate Committee staff, I was sent over to CREEP with some other more experienced investigators. And I cannot explain to you what I found there because there is no picture that adequately explains it. But since it was a pre-computer era, every piece of data that was needed by a presidential national campaign had to be on paper. It looked about like this, which is the closing scene from the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. Because there were, I think I saw 500 filing cabinets on just one floor. This was a massive activity. But I had been hired to deal with computers. And so I was put in charge of the computer printouts of all of the presidential campaigns, showing all the contributions. Some of y'all's names are probably on those computer lists. And I was in charge of big, gigantic computer printouts that I could barely hold in my hands, thicker than this picture, that showed every contribution to all of the presidential campaigns of 1972 that were in excess of $100. Also, to give you some sense of the state of the art. Remember, I was a slide rule guy. I got up there and had put in my hand, as part of my staff assignment, the first electronic calculator I had ever seen. Unbelievable, up-to-date technology. Well, let's talk about what happened in the Senate caucus room. By the way, for those of you who've seen these pictures over the years, those are the senators and their staff up there, and that piece of furniture looks like a headboard on an antique bed to me, and I'll reference that, so I want to point it out. Senator Sam Ervin is right under the flag, and the people in the audience are almost 100% media from across the country. There's one table up front where the witness who's being questioned would be sitting right in front of Sam Ervin. You can't really see such a person in this picture. And Sam Ervin was in charge. And those of us who are old enough to remember him were so proud of him as a North Carolinian. He was brilliant, he was witty, he was knowledgeable, he was persistent, he was authoritative. Well, over at the Blue Arrow, in front of that grill, was the staff bench. And so when I went into the hearings, and I was there the day that Donald Segretti testified to sabotaging the Democratic candidates. The reason I say Nixon would have beaten McGovern, but Donald Segretti told us in excruciating detail how he had sabotaged Edmund Muskie, the leading candidate, Hubert Humphrey, the second leading candidate, Scoop Jackson, the third leading candidate, all designed to make sure that McGovern got the Democratic nomination, and it did work. I went back years later and took this picture. The staff bench is still there, the grill is still there, the headboard is still there, the table is smaller. But that place that seemed so big to us in those days was really small and fairly intimate. Well, an important event in my life happened when Richard Nixon fired Archibald Cox, the man who was prosecuting him on the criminal side. Now, the Senate investigation was not a criminal investigation. It was to decide about legislation that was needed. Well, Robert Bork was the acting attorney general at that point, and he appointed Leon Jaworski, this is Jaworski, from Houston, Texas, to be the next special prosecutor. And coincidentally, I had actually met Jaworski, so I was very, very interested in this, but I was very uncertain about why Nixon had appointed him. And Nixon and Jaworski claimed in the media that they'd never met each other. Well, on Thanksgiving Day 1973, I was walking on N Street in Georgetown, back to my car, walking up the street toward the back of this picture. And I passed a couple of people who would be almost my grandparents' age to me. I recognized the face immediately, but I couldn't remember who it was. The guy got 20 feet past me, and I wheeled around and yelled the word Yarborough, at which he stopped. I ran up to him. He wasn't going to run up to me. And I said, "You're Senator Ralph Yarborough." And indeed, he was a retired senator who'd been defeated in 1970 after about 3 terms in the Senate from Texas. And I said at Georgetown Law School, well, that was nice. I'm working on the Watergate committee. He grabbed me, if we were here, almost out of her seat, me pick her up, by both lapels, and dragged me 30 feet away so his wife wouldn't hear and the guy I was with wouldn't hear. And he said like this, he gave me this for 3 minutes: "You tell Sam Ervin that Richard Nixon and Leon Jaworski are lying. They have met. They met at John Connolly's barbecue. It was in the Houston papers. I know it happened, and you've got to get this word. You tell Sam Ervin." I wasn't going to tell Sam Ervin anything except Senator Ervin, but he was a former senator. So, and it is true, there was a barbecue at Connolly's, Governor Connolly's ranch for Richard Nixon. That Jaworski's not in that picture, but it shows that Nixon was there. Now, I had to research on, well, first off, I was immediately given the job of help investigating Leon Jaworski, because I had been given the lead, and so they sent me to find out whether it was true. Well, the way to do that was to go over on the microfilm. For those of you who've never seen microfilm, go over to the Library of Congress and get one of those newspaper racks of that's thousands of them in picture number 1. Picture number 2 shows what microfilm looks like, and picture number 3 shows like what it looks like on the screen. We didn't even know what year the barbecue had been held, so I had to go back to about 1970, that's right, and search forward. I've jumped ahead, so you already know the story, but let me tell the story. We did not know that he was telling the truth. My job was to look at the front page of all the papers from Texas, going through a couple of years until I got to the date of the barbecue. By the way, you can find it in 4 seconds with Google. I had to go through about 2.5 years to find out that it was April 30th, 1972. Then I had to go through the microfilm of all the society pages of Texas a few days before and a few days after to find the guest list for the barbecue. Leon Jaworski was on the list. He was on the list. So I take my piece, I print off my microfilm, I take my piece of paper back to my superiors, and they say, well, we'll make sure he gets asked about this at his confirmation hearing. And indeed, he was asked. He was simply asked this. Basically, Mr. Jaworski, you say you've never met Richard Nixon. Nope, never met him. Well, isn't it a fact that you met him at John Connolly's barbecue? And he was there and you were there. And Jaworski maybe had foreseen the question, but in any case, he said, it is a fact that my name was listed as a guest invited to that event, but I did not attend, and I've never met Richard Nixon. And if you think about it, that was actually important, because that took a cloud that could have surfaced years later on the whole investigation if it had turned out that he had known Nixon. And so I was happy that I had played a small role in that, and I think my bosses were. Well, years later, I met Bob Woodward. He actually spoke here in Charlotte, and of course we have a rapport because I read his articles, and I was up there on the Hill. And I met Carl Bernstein a few years later. Same thing. You know, there's a certain amount of rapport for having been there. And in fact, I went to the 20th reunion of the Watergate committee staff, and there were some luminaries there, including Connie Chung, who those of you who are old enough to remember was a national TV news reporter who reported on the Watergate. And I had the privilege of meeting a man that I admired even then, who had been one of the 7 senators on the Watergate committee, who just recently died. I believe he'd won the Congressional Medal of Honor. He lost his arm in World War II, Senator Inouye from Hawaii. When the book came out, that was published after the committee was done, I found out what my job title was. I was a majority research staff assistant. I put an arrow by my name. They never told me. They just said, you're an investigator. And I said, fine, I'm an investigator. But I found out what I was officially. So, I'm going to stop before circumstances compel me to do so. And I'm going to say, as I always do, if it'll go forward, the end, and thank you.
We all knew how brilliant you were on several things, but we had no idea about the Howdy Doody thing. and by the way, I know every word of the Howdy Doody song, so prepare yourself. We have time for questions. Are there any questions for David? Ed?
David, what was some of the techniques that Segretti used to sabotage the leading candidates of the Democratic Party? The nomination.
By the way, I want to make sure I don't go over, but let me try that for about a minute and a half or so. The dirty tricks were grotesque. The one they made light of the fact of putting foul-smelling chemicals in the food at restaurants where the Democrats were having meetings. I mean, it just nauseated me. But the meanest, lowest, most racist, and unfortunately, potentially, internationally affairs affecting that he testified to that day was this. The Republicans created some, by the way, this is after McGovern had been nominated, some McGovern stationery. I think they'd actually stolen it. I think he said they stole it. But what they did was they created an event, a fictional event, at the Washington Hilton Hotel. They hadn't booked the hotel, but they sent out an invitation. And here's who they wrote to. And I hope I'm recalling this correctly, but it seems like I heard it yesterday, 40 years ago. They said, we invited half of the invitation list to be all of the ambassadors from the continent of Africa to the United States, and asked them to come to the Washington Hilton Hotel in their native costumes. And the other half, and I hope I'm recalling this correctly, they invited all the gay activists in America to come to the Washington Hilton, to an event that did not occur. And so, naturally, the McGovern campaign finds out much too late that this has even been set up, and it looks like they messed up. And all these people show up and are mad. So that's how bad the dirty tricks were. And there were many more. You remember they accused Muskie of racism toward French Canadians. They accused Scoop Jackson of having an illegitimate child. I've forgotten what the accusation against Hubert Humphrey was, but they threw him into the primaries exactly when that candidate would be most wounded by it. There's little doubt in my mind that they picked the candidate for the Democrats in 1972. Thank you.